Usually when we talk about a system, whether that's like a medical diagnosis or it's a strict legal code, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right.
I mean, it feels like engineering, right?
Right.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
entirely binary. I mean, it's either broken or it's not.
Exactly. It's clean, and frankly, it's comforting. We really like things to be visible. We like human behavior and societal rules to be categorized in these neat little boxes.
We do.
But today, for this deep dive, we are looking at what happens when you step into the world of human cognition, colliding with vast, chaotic digital networks. Suddenly, that X-ray machine is just completely broken.
And it's a case that perfectly illustrates a diagnostic landscape that is, frankly, incredibly murky.
Yeah, so our mission for you today is to explore what happens when a highly complex, multidisciplinary mind collides head-on with a rigid, binary institutional system. We're going to give you a shortcut to understanding the intersection of network physics, personality psychology, and the law.
It's a fascinating stack of documents.
It really is. We're looking at a massive stack today from the Copilot Chat 2ELMS documentation, analyzing this modern legal and psychological puzzle known as the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan. And just a quick heads up as we get started.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yeah, the source material we're looking at today contains some highly charged political and institutional themes regarding the Chinese legal system. Our goal here isn't to take a side or endorse any political view. We're just impartially unpacking the original ideas and facts contained in these documents, strictly to understand the theoretical frameworks, so the physics and the psychology being applied to this specific case.
That is a crucial baseline, and if you're looking at my backdrop today, you'll notice it's changed to a matrix of complex network diagrams intersecting with psychological profiles.
Setting the mood.
Always. We're looking at the mechanics of the situation here. We are looking at a fundamental cognitive collapse of an institution that is facing systemic complexity it simply cannot process.
Okay, so let's unpack this by looking at the specific legal charges first, because we have to understand what the institution claimed happened before we can bring in the science to dismantle it.
Right. The facts of the case.
Yeah. According to the documents, Dr. Chen was accused by the Xishan District Court of Kunming of causing severe public order disruption by forwarding what they called false information. Specifically, the claim was that the information he saved and forwarded was insulting or attacking leadership and political systems.
But, when you actually read the court's judgment in the documents, what really stands out is the absolute void of evidence supporting that specific legal conclusion.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. The court's judgment is a textbook example of replacing facts with conclusions.
How so? Like, what were they missing?
Well, they missed three foundational pillars of proof. First off, the court provided zero proof of false information. I mean, there was no official debunking cited, no authoritative fact check presented in the case. They just labeled it false.
Wow.
Yeah. Second, there was no proof of subjective knowledge.
Meaning they couldn't prove he actually knew the information was supposedly false when he forwarded it.
Exactly. And the way they handled this is stunning. They presumed his guilt based entirely on his high educational level.
Wait, what?
Yeah, their argument essentially boiled down to, well, you're a highly educated doctor, therefore you should automatically know better.
Hold on, so they just completely bypassed the burden of proof for intent. That's like, I don't know, charging someone with arson without proving there was a fire simply because they have a chemistry degree and own a box of matches.
That is a remarkably accurate way to put it, actually. And it gets worse with the third missing piece, which is the lack of proof for severe disruption.
Let me guess. Nothing actually happened.
Right. There were no riots in the streets of Kunming, no real-world chaos, no tangible societal breakdown that could be traced back to his digital activity.
But don't they have specific legal thresholds for what constitutes a digital disruption? Like hard numbers.
They do. If we look at the standards set by what is colloquially called the two highs, so that's the Supreme People's Court and the Supreme People's Procuratorate, their interpretation clearly establishes a numerical threshold.
Okay, and what is that threshold?
For forwarding digital information to be considered a crime of this magnitude, a specific post requires at least 500 retweets or 5,000 views.
Okay, and what were Dr. Chen's actual metrics?
He had fewer than 100 followers in total. His interaction rate on these posts was near absolute zero.
Okay, so the state is demanding that a cake exists without showing any of the ingredients, the recipe, or even the oven.
Pretty much.
But let me push back for a second, because I want to look at this from the institution's perspective. In the digital age, Isn't it possible for a tiny spark to start a massive forest fire?
Oh, the spark theory.
Right. Even if his specific post didn't hit 500 retweets immediately, couldn't the court be arguing potential harm? The idea that in a highly networked world, one bad post from a guy with 100 followers could spiral out of control and cause chaos.
You know, that is the exact intuition that drives a lot of these institutional decisions. It's the fear of the spark. But to understand why that intuition is scientifically flawed, why it's literally impossible in this specific case, we have to look at the actual physics of social networks.
Okay.
Because that theoretical spark you just mentioned, in this specific digital environment, it was scientifically guaranteed to extinguish.
Wait, you're moving from a legal accusation to digital physics. How does a digital spark mathematically just extinguish?
Well, the documents explain this by applying the CAC theorem. It was originally proposed by computer scientist Eric Brewer. CAP stands for consistency, availability, and partition tolerance.
Right.
The theorem proves that in any distributed system, you can only mathematically guarantee two of those three traits at any given time.
But Brewer's CAP theorem is a computer science concept about distributed database servers, right? Like making sure Amazon servers talk to each other.
Yeah, that's the one.
How does a database theory prove a guy forwarding a social media post didn't cause a real-world riot?
That is the brilliant connection the documents make here. A social media platform is, at its core, just a massive distributed database of human attention.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and because network partitions, meaning disconnections, lag, algorithmic filtering, or people just logging off, are physically inevitable, a social network can never be perfectly consistent.
Ah, I see. Meaning, not everyone on the network sees the exact same information at the exact same time.
Precisely. Because perfect consistency is physically impossible, disorder is not an anomaly. It is the baseline reality of the internet.
So disorder is just baked in.
Exactly. Therefore, you cannot legally accuse a single user of introducing disorder into a system that is fundamentally and mathematically defined by disorder.
That reframes things completely. The environment itself is chaotic by design.
Right. Now, you combine that baseline chaos with how social networks are actually structured. They're not flat grids where everyone is equally connected.
What are they then?
They're what network physicists call scale-free networks, which is described by the Barabasi-Albert model.
Okay, what does a scale-free network look like visually?
Imagine an airline map. You have massive, highly centralized hubs like Atlanta or O'Hare where thousands of flights connect.
Right, the super hubs.
Yeah, on a social network, those hubs are the algorithmically boosted accounts, celebrities, or major state media outlets. They have millions of connections. But the vast majority of the network is made up of tiny regional airports. These are the fringe nodes, regular people with very few connections.
And with fewer than 100 followers, Dr. Chen was a fringe node.
He was as fringe as it gets. His network degree was practically zero. And this brings us to the mathematical nail in the coffin for the course argument of severe disruption.
Yeah, be with it.
The documents cite Cohen's cascade collapse critical threshold.
Okay, that sounds incredibly intimidating. Break that math down for us.
I know, it sounds dense, but it's actually a beautiful concept that measures the structural robustness of a network. The formula calculates the critical threshold for a network to collapse, denoted as P sub c.
Okay.
In a scale-free network, P sub c is roughly equal to 1.
And what does that mean in plain English for Dr. Chen?
It means that because the network relies entirely on those massive superhubs to transmit information, you have to delete or disrupt almost 100% of the nodes to cause a systemic cascade collapse.
Really? Just deleting a few won't do it?
No. Because deleting a tiny fringe node doesn't sever the connections between the superhubs. If you delete or modify a fringe node like Dr. Chen, it has literally zero systemic impact. It cannot cause a cascade. Therefore, it cannot cause a severe public order disruption.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening at home. If we synthesize this math, if the social network is a massive solar system, Dr. Chen wasn't the sun. He wasn't even a planet. He was a microscopic speck of space dust. You cannot logically or mathematically blame a single speck of space dust for disrupting the gravitational pull of the entire solar system.
That is a fantastic analogy. Epidemiologists use a term called R0, the basic reproduction number, to measure how a virus spreads.
Oh, like during COVID.
Right. For a fringe node like Dr. Chen, the transmission chain, or the informational R0, is so far below 1 that the spread of his information will inevitably, mathematically, die out. It just cannot sustain a chain reaction.
But that raises a massive contradiction, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if the science is so definitive, and if it's mathematically proven that a fringe node's transmission chain will inevitably die out, why on earth did the judicial system see him as such an existential threat? I mean, the physics proved he was harmless, so why did they bring the hammer down on space dust?
Because they didn't punish him despite the physics. They punished him because they lacked the capacity to understand the physics.
That's correct.
Yeah, and to understand why that happened, we have to look at the psychology of the people involved. We have to look at the profound personality clash between Dr. Chen and the institution judging him.
So it isn't just a misunderstanding of facts, it's a fundamental misreading of character.
Exactly. The documents use two major, highly validated psychological frameworks to analyze Dr. Chen, the Big Five personality traits, and the Hex-Echo model. And his profile is really striking.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, he scores extremely high in openness.
Generally, that means someone is curious, right? Like they seek out new experiences.
Yes, but in a high-stakes cognitive sense, high openness means he naturally doubts authority, embraces uncertainty, and relies on complex, multidisciplinary systems to explain the world.
So he's not taking things at face value.
Exactly. He does not view information in simple true or false binaries. He views information as raw data to be researched, questioned, and synthesized.
Okay, how else did he profile?
He exhibits a very specific type of high conscientiousness. It isn't the follow every rule blindly type of conscientiousness. It's an academic conscientiousness.
Like dedicated to the truth.
Yes, he values internal logic, intellectual rigor, and self-consistency above all else. And when you combine that with his scores on the Hex-Echo model specifically, he has incredibly high honesty humility, but extremely low compliance.
Low compliance, but highly honest. That sounds like a dangerous combination in the courtroom.
It is. He absolutely refuses to say things he doesn't personally believe to be true. He will not flatter authority figures, and he will not strategically confess to something just to make his life easier.
He just won't play the game.
Right. And finally, the most critical trait, he has extremely low neuroticism.
Meaning he's on panic.
Right. Under immense, terrifying pressure, like a criminal interrogation, he remains highly calm, highly logical. He utilizes a psychological defense mechanism called sublimation.
Sublimation?
Yeah, he takes all that raw stress and fear and channels it into complex, detached academic arguments.
Oh, wow. I can see exactly how that plays out, and it's a disaster.
Why is that?
Think about it. If you're sitting in a stark interrogation room and a detective is screaming at you, demanding a confession, and instead of crying or begging or just saying, hey, I'm sorry, you're perfectly calm.
Just completely detached.
Right. You start citing Plato's K's or Gödel's incompleteness theorem to explain your epistemological process to the police officer. They aren't going to look at you and think, oh, what an intellectually humble and academically conscientious person.
Oh, definitely not.
They're going to think you're an arrogant, sociopathic jerk who is mocking them.
Exactly. It is an absolute recipe for a cultural and psychological misdiagnosis. His defense mechanism looks like pure defiance to an untrained observer.
But I have to ask, was he just being stubborn? I mean, could he have just swallowed his pride, played the game, and given them the simple confession they wanted to hear?
Well, that's where the documents introduce a crucial concept. The analysis suggests he was literally psychologically incapable of just playing the game.
Really? Incapable.
Yeah, he possesses what developmental psychologists call a post-conventional, highly integrated personality.
What does post-conventional mean in this context?
It means his moral compass is governed by internal, universal principles of truth and logic, not by external rules dictated by authority figures.
Yeah.
So for a post-conventional thinker to falsely confess that he knew the posts were false when his entire worldview is based on epistemological doubt and inquiry, it would completely shatter his core psychological structure.
So it wasn't pride, it was psychological survival.
Yes. He was driven by epistemic motivation. He was a knowledge seeker. To him, saving and forwarding those posts wasn't spreading political propaganda. It was collecting research data to understand a complex system.
So asking him to confess to malicious intent was asking him to destroy his own psychological integrity.
Precisely.
He literally couldn't compute the confession they demanded because it violated his fundamental operating system. Which naturally brings us to the other side of the desk.
It's the institution.
Right. If Dr. Chen's psychology was acting normally for a highly integrated academic mind, what was wrong with the institution's psychology? Why did they look at a curious academic and see a public threat?
Well, because institutions have psychologies too. They have collective behavioral traits. And the documents provide a fascinating, contrasting profile of the judicial institution involved here.
Okay, let's hear their profile.
First, it operates in an environment of extremely high pressure. It has an external locus of control, meaning its actions are driven entirely by strict rules, rigid procedures, and upper-level directives, rather than internal, flexible judgment.
So they're like middle managers terrified of making a mistake.
Exactly. Their primary motivation is extreme risk avoidance. And because of that intense systemic anxiety, the institution has an incredibly low tolerance for ambiguity.
They need things to be simple.
Right, they cannot process nuance. They require binary labels, true or false, right or wrong, harmless or dangerous. When they encountered Dr. Chen, his complexity didn't just confuse them, it triggered their institutional anxiety.
And how does an anxious institution behave in an interrogation room?
Through a mechanism psychologists call emotional attribution bias, because the institution needs to urgently regain a sense of control over a situation they don't understand, they project their own fears onto the subject.
Oh, I see.
So Dr. Chen's low neuroticism, his calmness, was falsely perceived as a bad attitude. His high openness and intellectual skepticism were perceived as intentional malice.
They took his academic curiosity and weaponized it against him in their own minds because they were scared.
Yes, it represents a profound clash in cultural psychology. You have Dr. Chen representing an individualistic, open, epistemic culture. He values truth-seeking and complexity.
And the institution.
On the exact opposite side, you have an institution representing a collectivist, authoritarian, certainty-driven culture. When the institution is faced with his immense complexity, they resort to heuristic processing.
Meaning they take a mental shortcut because they can't process the data.
Exactly. Engaging with his complex academic behavior would require time, patience, and cognitive flexibility that the institution simply does not possess.
Right.
So they take a shortcut, they slap a binary label on it, they label his inquiry as a rumor, they label his skepticism as a threat.
So what does this all mean when we put the pieces together?
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of trying to run a highly complex, multi-threaded AI program on a rigid, single-task operating system from, like, the 1980s.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it.
Right. The old operating system just doesn't have the syntax, the vocabulary, or the processing architecture to parse the commands the AI is giving it. It doesn't know how to understand the data. So it panics, throws out a generic fatal error message, and shuts the whole thing down.
Yeah.
Or in this case, it throws out a severe public order disruption charge.
Your operating system analogy is perfect. The documents emphasize that this isn't just a simple story about individual malicious police officers or a few corrupt judges acting in bad faith.
It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It is a story about a systemic cognitive collapse. It's what inevitably happens when a low-complexity institutional psychology is completely unable to tolerate a high-complexity individual psychology.
The system panicked.
The system panicked. It projected its own institutional anxiety onto Dr. Chen in a desperate attempt to regain a sense of control over an environment, the modern digital network, that it literally lacks the capacity to understand.
We started this deep dive looking for the jagged white line on an X-ray. We expected a clear, binary legal outcome based on hard facts. But instead, we found ourselves exploring the murky waters of colliding psychologies and the physical structure of scale-free social networks.
And what we found was that the jagged line on the X-ray wasn't a fracture in the law. It was a fracture in the institution's ability to comprehend reality.
For you listening, we've unpacked a massive, dense stack of legal, physical, and psychological documents today. And what we ultimately discovered is that the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan isn't just a story about a legal mistake or a localized miscarriage of justice.
No, it's not.
It's an absolute masterclass in how systems operate. And this applies to legal systems, corporate cultures, or even our own personal social circles. When a rigid system is faced with someone whose complexity it simply cannot compute, it doesn't adapt. It labels, it simplifies, and it punishes.
The human mind, when highly integrated and post-conventional, is a complex network all on its own. And when forced into a tiny binary box, the structural friction is immense.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. We've seen how a pre-modern binary institutional mindset completely failed to understand the physics of a modern digital network and the psychology of a complex thinker. The institution tried to use an outdated X-ray machine to diagnose a shadow.
Right.
But as our entire world becomes increasingly defined by nonlinear networks, algorithmic chaos, and incredibly complex AI systems, we have to ask ourselves, are the laws and institutions governing our daily lives equally outdated? Will we all eventually find ourselves judged by systems that literally lack the vocabulary to understand our reality?
That is a deeply sobering thought to leave on.
Keep questioning the systems around you, and keep exploring the complexity. Until next time.